I have an outstanding project to bring to you today. Back to school is just around the corner, and you need to be able to have all the different stuff that the kids need for school in one place. So I was given a photo and said, can you make this? Now this is going to be for an entryway organization area, and this is also perfect for a mudroom environment to be able to have all the kids' materials ready for school all in one place. Now the one difference that I'm going to do, this photo is actually showing where there are area for 3 bins. I'm going to make it where it will contain 4 bins, so there's 4 people that are going to be using this. So when this photo was given to me and they asked me, can you make this? I looked at the photo, thought for a moment, and I said, challenge accepted. This project has a shelf at the top, and it also has a bench at the bottom where you can sit and put on your shoes and gather your items. I'm going to begin this project by building the bench itself along with the shelf on the top. Now the bench is actually going to be laminated 2x4s. Now this is actually fir material. I wanted to get yellow pine because it actually stains a little bit better, but unfortunately the material at the big box store was not the best material. So I ended up choosing these. Now this project is going to be 80 inches long, and the width of this bench is going to be 17 3/4 of an inch. You may also notice that there are 6 of these 2x4s. Well, that's quite a bit wider than the 17 3/4 of an inch. Well, there's quite a bit of prep work that needs to happen to be able to get these 2x4s prepared and ready to be laminated together. Of course, the first thing that I need to do is cut all of these to length. I have found that the miter saw is the best tool to be able to use to cut all of these 2x4s to length. Now I set this up where I'm actually cutting that short block, but overall this is 80 inches long for the different 2x4s. My bench wasn't long enough just to set it up for the 80 inches and cut it that way, so I just measured the difference and set my stop block up on the short side to be able to cut these 2x4s. And that still will allow the 80 inches that I need for each of these 2x4s, and the rest will be scrap material that I'll use in another project. You'll notice on the edge of the 2x4 you have this little rounded corners. Now this little radius needs to get cut away because that would not look good if I tried to laminate it together and I had that radius there. So I'm going to take all of these over to the table saw, and I'll be removing roughly about 1/8 of an inch to be able to get rid of that little round over. I want to verify the width of these 2x4s. The actual 2x4 should be 3.5 inches, not the actual 4 inches. However, I've also found that some of the 2x4s are actually a little bit smaller than the 3.5 inches. So it's very important to verify the width and set the table saw up accordingly, because I only want to be able to remove about 1/8 of an inch off of each of the sides to be able to remove that little radius. I also am cutting this without the saw blade guard and the dust collection, so I wanted you to be able to see just how small of a cut that I'm making. This is just over 1/8 of an inch to be able to completely remove that radius, because I need a nice sharp edge to be able to laminate these together. I'm putting a pencil line all along the edge. In fact, I'm putting a pencil line on all of the sides of the 2x4. Even though the table saw does a really good job on cutting a nice straight line, it's still not good enough to be able to laminate it together. So I'm marking all of these 2x4s to bring it over to the jointer to be able to just make these edges a little bit straighter. And I want to be able to also joint the top and the bottom to be able to make it where it's just as smooth as I possibly can. It's very important to have the pencil line on there, because once you run this through the jointer, you want to look at that edge, and if there's still a little bit of the pencil line there, you'll need to run it through one more time, because it's still not as flat as you can possibly get it. And that is the goal on this process, because what that will result in is a nice, flat, good, solid joint when you join these together. It will look as if it is just one board, and that's the goal. By running the material through the jointer on the flat side, it also will remove a lot of the imperfections that occurred during the milling process at the actual mill. So this takes a little bit of time to be able to do this and prepare all of this material, but it's well worth the time spent doing this whole process because the end results will really make a big difference. The next step is to line up all of the boards and move them around to be able to get the grain pattern to look as you want it to look. And that to me is a very important step. Now these are going to be joined together using biscuit joints. That's right, I'm going to use the biscuit joints to be able to put these together, and this is what the little biscuits look like. They're just compressed wood that when you put the glue on it and you have it in the slot in these different boards, they'll actually expand and make for a very good solid joint. Now I have a pipe clamp on here just temporarily so that I can get all of these boards numbered and I have it aligned exactly the way that I want them. I'm using this router with this old Craftsman attachment. This is probably one of the oldest biscuit cutting tools that you could possibly find, but it still works good and there's no reason to replace it. So this is what I'm going to be using to cut these slots for these biscuits. Now this router and this jig are probably over 50 years old, but to me that's okay. It still works just as if it was brand new. So why not use what you have rather than having to go out and spend money on something that probably wouldn't do as good of a job as what this old jig and router does. So I'm very happy with this setup. The way this works is you just take the router and put it right down on the surface of the material and then push it into the wood itself. And you can see how that compresses on that jig and allows that bit to go into the wood at a predetermined depth. And then you just slide the router left and right and it cuts these slots. These slots are actually cut all along both sides of the board to be able to have a matching set. And from there, when it's time to join them together, we're going to put in glue, lots of glue, and we're also going to put glue into those slots themselves. Then the little biscuits will get dropped right down into those slots. And of course, we're going to spread out the glue to get really good coverage, and then we'll join the 2x4s together. There's also a reference line on the 2x4s themselves to make sure that they're all aligned exactly as they should be, and with the numbers on there, it makes it very easy to be able to assemble this. Now, if for some reason you don't number these and you don't put the reference lines on, well, then quite frankly, you could get into a real big mess because it would not be oriented correctly and it may be misaligned. So that step is also very important to be able to do. Now it's time to add clamps. And I'm using clamps both on the top and the bottom to be able to help to keep it flat while the glue is drying. Now here's a very important step that you don't want to miss. You see I'm attaching a board right now, and that board actually helps to ensure that this top is completely flat. And you see in the foreground I already have attached this one at the other end. With that attached, it is going to be flat. Now you want to make sure that you put some tape on that edge on that board, because if you do not, that will glue to the surface of the bench and that would not make for a very good day. So I use a regular packing tape on that board and then attach it with the clamps, and that will ensure that this top is completely 100% flat. You also notice as I add the clamps to this top, I'm actually coming back and adjusting all of the clamps. Just tighten it down a little bit tighter. I want to make sure that I have even pressure on all of the various clamps. So I'll make that adjustment several times as I add more and more clamps to this top to be able to make sure that I have even pressure and that this top is completely flat. So this is some small items that need to be done to be able to address and make sure that we get exactly the results that we're looking for. And as you tighten these clamps, that glue is going to squeeze out, and yes, you're going to have quite a bit of glue that squeezes out onto the surface. You want to take a little putty knife, and I'm just using a little plastic knife to be able to scrape all of that excess glue off. And the other thing is, if you see that a little bit of an imperfection there where the joints aren't completely lined up, you can tap with the rubber hammer just to make sure that those are completely flat and aligned the way they should be. And the best way to do that is just rub your finger across the surface just to double check it, and you can make those small little adjustments as necessary. Yes, I use a lot of clamps, and you never have too many clamps in the shop. Well, it's the next morning, and it's time now to remove all of the clamps. Now, one of the things that I wanted to show you close up is this board. You notice how easy it comes off. This is the packing tape that I put onto the board that protects it, because the glue will not stick to that. As I flip over the top to the underside, I have a lot of the little drops of the glue that have dripped out. And that's okay. Again, you can take a putty knife and scrape off the majority of those very easily. And to me, it's a lot better to be able to scrape these off than to try to sand them off. So just take the putty knife, scrape them, and the vast majority will come off very easily. I start the sanding process with the belt sander. Now this is 60 grit paper, and this does really well to be able to remove all of the glue and the pencil marks off of the surface of this. The next step is I'm going to switch over to the disc sander, and I'm going to be using the Starbond sanding disc, and again I'm going to start with the 60 grit paper. And I'm going to go through progressive steps from the 60 all the way up to the 220 to be able to give a really smooth surface on this bench top. Now the sanding process actually goes fairly quick, because this sanding from 60 all the way up to the 220 grit does not take long at all, and it makes for an absolutely smooth surface. Now one of the things that's very important is to make sure that you use the dust collection. So I'm going to grab the appropriate nozzle to be able to attach to the disc sander, and I'm going to start sanding. Again, I'm going from 60 grit up to 220 grit, and this is virtually dust free with the dust collection system in place. So after sanding this a few minutes and getting it really nice and smooth, you can see up close how this looks absolutely amazing. The joints in here are extremely tight, smooth, and this is what the type of surface that you're looking for. So I'm very happy with this. The only thing that's left now is to be able to fill these voids, and I'll do a final sanding. Now to be able to fill these voids, I'm going to be using the Starbond CA glue to fill all of these little holes in these knots. Using this type of material with the knot holes, this is the one drawback that you will have, is that you'll have these little holes in the knots, and there'll be some of these little small knots that are just not stable. But the CA glue from Starbond works extremely well to be able to stabilize all of these little spots. Now in my bucket is some perfect material to be able to use to fill those little small holes in those knots. Okay, I've got all the holes filled, and I also want to check for flatness, and that is really good. When I cut these boards initially, I cut them a little bit long. Remember, the total length needs to be 80 inches. So now it's time to be able to come through and cut off the little bit of excess to get the exact length that I need, which is the 80 inches. And to do that, I'm going to be using a circular saw to be able to make this cut. I'm using this very simple jig that I made a number of years ago. It's similar to a track saw, but this was made before track saws even existed. And literally all I do is just line up that edge to the pencil bark that I made for the cut line, clamp this down, and then I'll use the circular saw and make the cut. So what you're looking at is some very old technology. Long before they had track saws, this is what we used to be able to make these types of cuts. So there's no need to buy a track saw when this type of old school technology works so well. The next step is I want to show you how I made these shelf brackets. Very simple, very easy, and again, some old school technology. So I use the socket to be able to get the small radius. I use a paint can to get the larger radius. And once I have the original one drawn, then you can just trace out the original one to duplicate it. So it begins to be a real easy process. As far as the sanding, of course I'm going to use the oscillating sander to be able to make quick work of the sanding process. To be able to do the small detail work and get into these little corners, I'll use this small little belt sander and it does the job. The results I think are absolutely amazing. The design for this shelf bracket actually came from the photo. I copied this as close as I could to be able to make exactly what they were looking for. As far as the top shelf, I'll use an old piece of material that I had left over from another project, and for this, yes, I do need to cut off these dowel rods. Do not need these any longer, and the nice thing about it is the width of this is already the 10 inches that I need. So all I need to be able to do is cut it to the length, and of course I'm going to use a circular saw to be able to do this. And then it's off to the planer to be able to make sure that it's perfectly flat. And again, you notice I use the pencil lines on there just to make sure as I run it through that I do get it flat. And it did take a couple of passes to be able to get it completely smooth. Oh, and yes, you can't leave out the sanding. Again, I took it from the 80 grit paper all the way up to 220 grit to make it nice and smooth. The final step for the shelf and for the bench itself is to be able to put this 45-degree bevel onto the edge. And I'm just using a trim router to do this, and I'm going to run it around on all of the sides that will be exposed. And by that, I mean the exposed edges that will actually get seen. If the edge is going to be against a wall, well, I don't need to use the router to put this bevel on there. I think this looks extremely good, and it puts a finishing touch on this whole entire project. This also matches the dining room table that is in the home already, so it's a good complementary piece to be able to add to the overall look. And here's a close-up look at this 45-degree bit that I used in the trim router. At this point, all that's left to do is to stain the wood itself. And I'm using a Minwax Espresso stain to be able to do this, and it just wipe off the excess, and then I'll set it aside in a separate room so that it'll dry. In the meantime, I'm going to start building the pedestals. Now the pedestal is going to be made out of a 1/2-inch plywood. They'll be, of course, 15.5 inches tall, making the overall bench 17 inches tall, and that's the perfect height to be able to sit down on. It's basically chair height. Now as far as the depth, I'll make these 16 inches so that the bench itself will have a little bit of an overhang. So this is the second cut that I have, because I ripped all the pieces, the 15.5 inches, then I rotated those and cut those as 16 inches that I need. Now I need a total of 10 pieces because I'm making 5 pedestals. The width of the pedestal itself is going to be 3 inches. So I also had to rip that material down, and now I'm just cutting those to length. Once I have all 5 of these pieces done, then I'm ready to be able to make the rabbet joint to be able to receive the sides and create my actual box. To be able to create the rabbet joint, it's only 2 cuts. I lower the table saw blade down to where it's a little bit more than halfway cutting through the material, and as far as the fence is set up to be able to cut the width of the 1/2-inch plywood. And then from there, I'll just make the cut. Now this is a very safe cut because the blade does not come through the material at all. To make the second cut of this rabbet cut, I just need to adjust the fence and the height to be able to correspond to that first cut. Again, this is a very safe cut to make because you're only exposing a very, very small amount of the blade, and your hands are far away from the blade itself. Here's a look at the close-up view of the rabbet joint on this front edge of the material. Now this is the perfect width to be able to receive that 1/2-inch plywood. That's what I'm looking for. That way there's very little raw edge exposed, and that will be a good joint to be able to have for these pedestals. Not only does it look good, but it's very strong because it has a lot of gluing surface to be able to hold in place. The last piece of wood that I need is the back of the pedestal itself, and that's going to be 2 inches wide. Now I'm using some scrap material to be able to get my 2-inch material that I need for that back. Now here's a close-up look of the front of the pedestal, all assembled with the glue and the nails. And then I'm going to turn it around so that you can see the rear of it. And this will show the 2-inch strip that I put in. Now this is not cut all the way to the top, and there's a reason for that, because there will need to be a cleat that will be put onto the bench itself and stabilize the pedestal to the bench. The next piece of plywood that I need to cut is the part that actually goes on the wall, from the bench to the shelf above. Now I'm using a 1/4-inch piece of the plywood to be able to cut this to the proper length. Once this is done, all my cuts will be done and I'm ready to paint. I'm putting 2 coats of paint on everything and of course sanding in between. I'm using a roller to be able to put the paint on because it actually goes much quicker and it avoids having all the brush strokes. This creates a very smooth finish and is perfect for what I want for this project. To seal the bench and the shelf itself, I'm using a water-based polyurethane finish. Now this is a satin finish that it will complement what's already in the home. And again, I'm going to put 2 coats on this and I will sand in between. You can see the shelf on the background and it looks absolutely amazing. There's no brush marks, perfectly smooth, and I love the satin finish. Now this was the first coat that I had put onto the project, and of course again I'm going to sand and then I'll put the second coat on and it will look even better. So thanks a lot for watching this video today. I hope that you was able to learn exactly how to be able to make this entryway organizational area. Now, if you want to take a look at this video right here, this will actually show you the installation of this entryway organization. If you found this video useful, I hope that you'll take the opportunity to subscribe right down there and hit that bell notification. It really does help. Leave me a comment on what you think of this design and how you could adapt it into your home. So for now, everyone, I look forward to seeing each and every one of you in the next video. So for now, bye-bye. See you real soon.